Banking crises, these were not uncommon in Hong Kong. And of course, that's how the Hang Seng Bank became a subsidiary of the Hong Kong Bank. Oh, it's a great museum. I came to Hong Kong in January 1970, and I came here to teach at Hong Kong U. I originally gave notice to the university to finish my three-year term in December 1972, and I was going to join Jardine Fleming, which had just started a year or so earlier as the first merchant bank based here in Hong Kong. And they were looking for a lawyer to join their corporate finance team, which had previously been made up of an accountant, a business school graduate, someone who knew something about computers, and they thought they'd round it off by having a lawyer.
At a time when the market was just going up and up and up, I was persuaded to buy a few things on margin, which was an absolute mistake. So 87 comes along, and that was awkward. Where I was in London was not too far away from the Hong Kong office, so I thought, well, you know, they did say they were going to tell me, so I think I'm going to go there and give them a piece of my mind. I went to the reception and said, my name's David Lindsay. I had an interview in June. I was told that I'd be informed whether I was successful or not. And she said, what's your name again? And I said, David Lindsay, and she goes rustling through a whole bunch of envelopes. She said, you're supposed to be in Hong Kong. So I said, well, nobody told me.
I remember the gentleman here at the bottom, Sir William Purvis, who's very much respected in the organisation. He was leading HSBC at the same time as I was coming in to my sort of early years in banking. So he was a very fine gentleman and always very generous with his advice. Everybody will remember Ireland in the 1980s was a very small, export-oriented country, and my father was in international trade, international marketing, so he travelled an awful lot, particularly in Asia, and he would come back to Dublin with tales of life in Asia and in his travels. And at the time I kind of figured out I was studying economics and commerce, and I sort of thought I wanted to do something around banking, but really hadn't got very far. But my main motivation towards the end of my studies was I just realized I wanted to travel. I had applied to a bunch of financial services organizations in Asia, and almost on a whim also applied for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Then the job offer followed a great process, and I was delighted. So my first day in the London office was in the 30th of September 1987, and several weeks later I was on an aeroplane to Hong Kong.
I qualified as a Scottish CPA in '64. My father was a master in the clan line, sailing out of Liverpool to Australia, calling in occasionally at Singapore and Hong Kong. So when I inquired of him what were his suggestions regarding short-term future at least, he said, why not give the Far East a go? At that time there were no vacancies in Singapore, but there were vacancies at the two leading firms in Hong Kong. So I applied to both, was accepted by both. The contracts were exactly the same, except the name at the top was different. So I tossed a coin and it came down A, and I joined A, which was Pete Marwick in those days. I arrived on November Thursday. On the Friday, I was taken to the Hong Kong Bank to get a bank account. And on the Saturday, I was working at the Jockey Club. Pete Marwick were the treasurers of the Jockey Club, and they provided most of the staff for the racing. Racing was on a Saturday at Happy Valley, obviously. Usually 2 races late morning, followed by a lunch, and then maybe 6 races afterwards. The local staff of the office did the punching of the tickets, and the Europeans, such as myself, were called booth supervisors. And that was my introduction to Hong Kong.
1, 2, 3, I'm at Exchange Square Plaza, Hong Kong. And in front of me, I'm looking at the home of Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing Limited, the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Futures Exchange, and the 3 clearing houses. You could say the centre of Hong Kong's financial markets. Has it always been this way? No. If this was the 1960s, I would be walking in the Hong Kong harbour, probably swimming. So how is it now land? Well, in the 1960s, Hong Kong was an industrial powerhouse, manufacturing and exporting all over the world. The economy was growing, and there became a strong demand for commercial and financial office space. But there was nowhere to build, and so the government reclaimed this part of the harbour. And it was in February 1982 that Hong Kong Land put in the winning bid to acquire this plot. Exchange Square started to be built in 1983 and was completed in 1985. So, was Hong Kong always an international financial centre? Far from it. In relative terms, it's new.
In the early 1970s, 80% of Hong Kong's activity was manufacturing. So manufacturing basically meant textiles, cheap, low-cost vests, underwear, shirts, electronic toys, human hair wigs. Those were the big kind of businesses of the manufacturing. Hong Kong in the early 70s was absolutely not a financial centre, and definitely not an international financial centre. And that came about, really, I think Jardine Fleming played a key role in the development of that. People see what we were doing, brought more competitors to Hong Kong.
1970s, I guess, I started learning more about Japan. Japan in those days was still sorting itself out after the war. The recognition of Japan in Hong Kong at that time were a couple of banks. There were several manufacturer and trading companies here, all wanting to grow. And it was noticeable at that time in Japan that Japan Inc. was building up to establish itself much more overseas. And the word that the firm that I worked for got through sources at MOF, Ministry of Finance, was that the intention was to encourage the leading banks, the city banks, to go overseas. The 3 offices or countries that they were suggesting: London, England, New York, US, and Hong Kong. And as soon as Bank of Yokohama, which is a regional bank, got a license to come here, there was a steady procession of other leading regional banks coming here. And I guess at one point in time, we probably had, if you put them all together, about 25 banking clients.
In the 80s, the Japanese banks dominated the whole banking situation globally. I think if we were trying to look back at the top 5 banks in terms of assets, they were all Japanese back in the mid-80s.
Since the Second World War, Hong Kong's economy has experienced significant growth. A lot of it enabled by laissez-faire economic policies from the government during the 50s, 60s and 70s. Now, in 1945, after the war, the population of Hong Kong was around 600,000, having been 1.5 million before the war, so a lot of migration. Population of Hong Kong now is in excess of 7.5 million. Now, just after the war, the income per capita in Hong Kong was 30% of Britain's, but 50 years later, it was 40% more than Britain's income per capita. A great deal of economic growth. Indeed, the Financial Secretary of Hong Kong, Sir John Cowperthwaite, from 1961 to 1971, is now referred to as Hong Kong's architect of prosperity.
There are a number of reasons why, or a number of things that came together and why the stock market was moving in 71, 72, 73 and before the collapse, was that there had only been the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It was old money. It wasn't exclusively Brits by any means. There were a number of Chinese on that. It was a de facto monopoly, and people didn't realize that you could just start another stock exchange, and that's what Ronald Lee realized that you could, and that's what he did. So that got a big popular expansion of the stock market.
Growing prosperity in the 1960s in Hong Kong led to an increase in stock market activity, although there was only one stock exchange at that time, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and it was fairly rudimentary. Now, the government had a policy of hands-off. They very much followed the Adam Smith principle of the invisible hand, and they had no intention of regulating the financial markets. And so it was that in 1969, Ronald Lee realized you could make money by running a stock market, and there was demand. And so he started the Far East Stock Exchange. Another 2 exchanges were started in 1970 and 1971. So through the 70s, we had 4 stock exchanges at play, and they provided the platform for the wild financial gyrations that were to follow. With the increase in stock market activity in the 1970s, investors started to look for ways to increase the value of those investments. And one way was acquisitions. Now, in 1970, Henry Keswick became the managing director of the Jardine Group at 32 years of age. And he decided to introduce the first merchant bank into Hong Kong to help with acquisitions. He brought together the Jardine Group and Robert Fleming of London, an investment bank, and he created Jardine Fleming. Now, one of the first big deals that Jardine Fleming advised on was the acquisition of Dairy Farm in 1972. Dairy Farm, a company that had been started in 1886, was now being sold to the Jardine Group in the first hostile takeover that Hong Kong had ever seen.
The reason that they wanted me to join earlier was because Jardine Fleming had just announced the first ever contested takeover bid for a major listed company in Hong Kong. And we were doing it on behalf of Hong Kong Land, who made a takeover bid for Dairy Farm. Dairy Farm at that time was a company which had supermarkets, but it sold milk and milk products, hence the name. We had real live cows in the Port Fulham area, just beyond the university accommodation in Middleton Towers. One of the first things we did when I got there was to go and look at the register of members of Dairy Farm, which was kept at their registered office here in Central. And it was kept in beautiful copper plate writing. It was all written out by a man who had wonderful pen and ink skills. So we went to see who were the major shareholders. Dairy Farm at that point was quite a widely owned company. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible to make a contested bid, because you would have had to deal with a 50 or 60% shareholder, and that was not the case of Dairy Farm. Of course, while we were looking at that, Dairy Farm was not able to keep the register up to date because they only had the one register, and I was looking at it. When we found the names of major holders, or apparent major holders of the shares, we would then kind of divide up the workload, and Henry Keswick, who was the chairman of Jardines and therefore the chairman of Hong Kong Land at that time, went knocking on doors to people that they owned 50,000 shares or 100,000 shares. I found that the Bishop of Macau had a large number of shares, several 100,000 shares. And so as they worked down the list, this became an important number. And I was asked to go over to Macau and speak with the bishop and tell him that the bid was taking place, because most likely he wouldn't know. I mean, if you weren't living in Hong Kong, and if you weren't concerned with things spiritual rather than matters temporal, he wouldn't have known about this. So I took the ferry over. There were only one or two ferries a day in those days, and I got an appointment to go and see the bishop. And I explained to him the offer that we were making, and I said the share price before the offer was X, and we were offering you X plus, and Hong Kong Land, you know the company anyway, and you have a number of shares. He said, yes, thank you for coming to see me, my son. I will accept the offer. So I went back to Hong Kong that day quite happy that I'd collected a commitment for 200,000 or 300,000 shares, quite a big number, maybe 4 or 5% of the company. He said he would send us the shares, and about 4 or 5 days later, some shares arrived, packaged up. And when we opened them, actually we were a little bit surprised, because they turned out to be Hong Kong Land shares, and indeed Hong Kong Land was making the offer, not Dairy Farm. So I wondered if I'd explained the offer adequately to him. So we had to go and speak with him again and say, look, that's very kind, but actually if you accept the offer from Hong Kong Land, it's Dairy Farm shares we want. Well, okay, my son, I will attend to that. So he then sent over the dairy farm shares.
Hong Kong Land didn't waste much time in developing the land they had acquired when it acquired Dairy Farm in 1972. Dairy Farm was started not as a supermarket chain, but as a farm in 1886 by a Scottish doctor, Patrick Manson, who, when he arrived in Hong Kong, realised that the Hong Kong residents' diets were not good. He believed the introduction of fresh milk would be a major benefit, and so he imported 100 cows, and those cows would have grazed where I am standing now. And as you see, they could well have been inspired by the view of the sea and Lama. Well, Hong Kong Land moved the cows north and redeveloped the farmland into multiple residential tower blocks that are now known as Chi Fu Fa Yuen Estate.
So our bid closed in November. W.I. Carr, who were here as stockbrokers and did some research and were the stockbroker that people in England would speak to about what's going on in Hong Kong. They put out some research saying the Hang Seng Index was about 1,000, and they said it's high, it's too high, you should sell. So they weren't necessarily wrong, but between December and March, it went up another 700, so that's 70% more than W.I. Carr was saying, and they went up for a number of reasons. The man in the street had made money on one deal, there's another deal coming, what would it be? It was a retail-driven market. W.I. Carr, had a lot of egg on their face because they told everyone in London, 1,000 is a good number, you should sell. I think in the mid-70s, the Securities Commission was formed. The government thought that they should have some body looking at these things. The reason that Hong Kong grew as a financial centre was because Sir John Cowperthwaite, who was the financial secretary through the latter part of the 60s and early 70s, had this very clear economic philosophy based on Adam Smith's invisible hand and so on. His belief was that government should not intervene unless it really had to. So he had a policy that he called positive non-intervention. It's not that we're not intervening because we haven't thought about it. We've thought about it, and we think the business people understand better the needs of the business markets. And as long as you don't break the law, as long as you're not committing any crime, you get on and do business as you want. So that is why in the early 70s there was no control over these things, and we brought in some self-control. Government, I guess someone in the Financial Secretary's Department, created a small Securities Commission so that they had some oversight and some understanding, maybe some expertise of what was going on in the financial market. It was a very small body at that stage, and the head of it was brought in from somewhere in the Bank of England in London, came out, and then they allocated some other civil servants and so on. But it was all guided under the principle of positive non-intervention. Let's find out what's going on, but let's not think that we know better than the business community.
Alan's recollection of government oversight of Hong Kong's financial markets in the early 1970s is pretty accurate. In January 1973, the Hong Kong government appointed Mr. James Selwyn, who had previously worked for the Bank of England, as the first Commissioner of Securities, although the Securities Commission was not actually formed until 1975. As Alan remembers, the Hong Kong stock market appeared to defy gravity during the first quarter of 1973, drawing the attention of Hong Kong's press to Mr. Selwyn's recent appointment. On Sunday 25th February 1973, the South China Sunday Post asked, "How far should the government interfere, if at all, to take the heat out of the stock market?" The article continued by reporting, "The Commissioner for Securities, Mr. James Selwyn, this week spoke of the need for a regulated decline, but he admitted that he did not know how to achieve it without the risk of a serious lull, even a crash." Interestingly, the same article reported that the editor of the influential Investors Chronicle, Mr. Andreas Whittam Smith, who was visiting Hong Kong at the time, had remarked that the idea of any government trying to engineer a 10 or 20% decline in a market is ludicrous. It is fair to say that Hong Kong financial market regulation in the 1970s was light. But it's worth noting that in February 1973, enactment of the Stock Exchange Control Ordinance effectively banned any further stock exchange from being set up. Excitement in the Hong Kong financial markets petered out in the mid to late 1970s and remained low while the uncertainties of any sovereignty change lurked, until 1984, when decisions were made and agreements were signed. Let's go back and hear more from Alan.
I think following the signing of the Sino-British agreement in 1984, setting out the future of Hong Kong and 50 years no change and all of that, I think by and large the market took that very positively, particularly as China itself, with Deng Xiaoping's open door policy, was beginning to gain some momentum. So you had a period with the stock market by and large heading north, and which itself encouraged people to put more money in the market, more people. And I think worldwide there was pretty strong or pretty reasonable market performance.
January 86, and I went straight to work with Jones Lang Wood and here. A lot of people were talking about the stock market, it was going up and everybody seemed to be making money. You get carried away with this sort of stuff. When you're really aware of it, you sort of get sucked in. It was palpable with regard to the amount of money generation that was going on. I mean, everybody was in the stock market. The maid down the road was the old Armours were investing.
Black Monday in October 1987, I think it came as a shock to me. I can't explain why it happened that day, why not a month earlier, why not a month later. There was nothing that I particularly aware of. The only thing that was unique to Hong Kong on that, and Hong Kong was the first market to tank, was that the previous weekend there was a consortium of Chinese property companies that were talking about making a bid for Hong Kong land or for key parts of the Jardine Group. If that were to happen, should that have happened, that would have been even more bullish for the market.
recall going to a tailor just off Nathan Road on the Thursday or possibly the Friday of that week of Black Monday, and kind of breaking into a bit of conversation as one does, as one was being fitted for the suit. And the tailor, who was, I recall, a middle-aged gentleman who clearly knew something about the markets, and telling me all about what was happening that week. You know, he was saying this was kind of desperate, and all my savings, were in the local stock market, which has gone up by close to 90%. And I said, wow, 90% in the last year, that seems fantastic, you know. And he said, well, no, it's not fantastic. It was fantastic. He made a wonderful suit, and it fitted like a glove. But I do recall being, feeling very sorry for him. I didn't really understand what had happened. The tailor was being very professional, but clearly this had all been very sort of traumatic and very personal.
Can I open an account? And he said, yeah, do this, that, and the other. And by the way, we offer margin. So I said, oh, great. So I don't have to spend any money. And he said, yeah, well, you have to spend a little bit, but I mean, we can, essentially lending you money to buy stock, and then it gets to a certain point, you sell it off and you've made a profit, and then you do it all over again. And I said, oh, that sounds like a deal. And of course, the market was going up and up and up and up, and all was well until it wasn't. And then, the crash happened. And I remember thinking, uh-oh, this is not good. And of course, you have to call in the debt, essentially, which was really, it wasn't a huge amount of money in terms of the greater scheme of things, but it was a lot of money to me, and it was emotionally very distressing, I have to say. Felt kind of a bit of a failure, and everybody was talking about it and wondering what the hell was going to happen. And, you can't get your money out, you can't do anything. But, it happens, and there were calm voices around saying, okay, it's going to crash, but you're not going to necessarily lose it. If you hold the stock, you hold the stock, and it'll come back.
So in Hong Kong, when the collapse happened, and then New York and Europe came off, that kind of confirmed that the market should be going down. A lot of people panicked. And these things get a grip on themselves. And at the background to that, in particular in Hong Kong, was that we had a relatively newly established futures operation. So a lot of people talk about Black Monday as being a stock market crisis, but I think that is a misunderstanding and a misnomer of what it was. In Hong Kong, the problem was not the stock market, which would sort itself out. It was the futures exchange, which had been set up by government, actually did not have the proper rules in place. As JF, we were not concerned about defaults on the stock market because the brokers there were solid, they had assets and so on. It was the defaults on the futures exchange where a number of American houses had permitted Hong Kong people to trade with no security or with totally inadequate security. As the stock market went up, they hadn't been raising their margins and demanding that. The crisis was how many people on the futures exchange would default. So it was made worse by the fact that the stock exchange refused to close. The financial secretary, Piers Jacobs, wanted the stock markets to close and asked Ronald Lee to do it.
Black Monday, which occurred in a number of financial centres around the world on Monday, 19th October 1987, was less of a concern in Hong Kong than the enforced closure of the markets for the remainder of that week, and the work that was required to ensure that markets remained solvent when they finally opened on Monday, 26th October 1987. On Wednesday, 28th October 1987, the South China Morning Post ran a story highlighting the urgency for an inquiry into what had gone wrong and how to sort it.
The article reported on early public comments, noting that in his first public comment on the crisis, Mr. William Purvis, the chairman of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, last night voiced support for government moves to save the market, but said that Hong Kong's reputation as an international financial centre had suffered. If regulation and management of the territory's financial institutions needed to be reformed, it should be done without delay. The article continued, informed government sources said last night that the government wanted the Securities Commission to have more power over the exchanges following the turmoil on both markets. The government did indeed pursue market regulatory reform, but first it had to find someone to head up an investigation into what had happened. Back to Alan.
The aftermath of that was that they decided to strengthen the regulation and control of the securities and futures industry. They hunted around and brought out Ian Hay Davidson, who was well known as a head of an accounting firm. I must have had some meeting with Ian Hay Davidson. I would have told him what I thought, which is that it was a futures problem. When it came to drafting the SFC ordinance, then I was involved in seeing early drafts, commenting on it. We had a lot of discussion, a lot of arguments over what provisions they should be putting into that, because the whole drift of it was to prohibit this, to stop that, to regulate the other. You cannot regulate a business into being, but you can regulate it out of existence. And my concern was that that is the way that that bill was being drafted, looking at all the things they didn't like and prohibiting them. So I asked them, what's the purpose of this ordinance? The purpose must be to promote Hong Kong as a financial centre. That is why we're doing it. We're not regulating it because regulation is a good in its own right. We're doing it so that Hong Kong can get back on its feet in a number of areas. Financial services is a great business for Hong Kong, but we must not lose sight of the fact that the purpose of it is to promote Hong Kong as a financial centre.
So I think the creation of the SFC was entirely sensible. I've always believed, even in my early days before joining, in some form of, before the term was introduced, sensible form of risk management. So I actually, again, on reflection, didn't like it at the time necessarily because I felt it was a restraint on my kind of personal delegated authority within the bank. Time and experience is wonderful in that regard. The creation of those checks and balances was entirely sensible.
The introduction of the SFC was obviously good for Hong Kong. Perhaps could have been done earlier. It was slow to begin with because it was new in the marketplace. And there were obviously individuals who were not happy with the SFC coming in and what it was promising to do, because it was interfering in a way with their own particular patches. But at the end of the day, I think we got there, and obviously good for Hong Kong eventually, but slow.
6 years later, I found myself in India at the period when the markets were subject to extraordinary liberalization. And for that first time, I think it was I can't remember the exact date, but it was around the middle of 1993 when the finance minister in India at the time, Manmohan Singh, announced that the stock markets in India would be opened up to foreign investment. And I remember visiting regulators at the time as a banker in Bombay to talk about some of the principles that would be followed and how they would legislate the licensing of foreign investors. And they very much referenced some of the reforms that had been introduced in Hong Kong a few years earlier, recognizing that there was massive potential of the markets, and I wouldn't go as far to say that they were replicating, but they were certainly referencing and building off that learning as a result of the introduction of the SFC. And I think there was that high regard for the Hong Kong financial markets across all of Asia Pacific. That was a general impression, but my specific impression in India was those reforms were held in a high degree of respect, and they wanted to avoid any of the issues that may have taken place in Hong Kong pre the introduction of the SFC taking place in India.
Hong Kong, unlike many other places, does learn from each of its crises. Here we have banking crisis, we have runs on banks, and both the man in the street and the government and banks learn something from that, and we don't have a repeat of the same thing.
So that brings us to the end of this story on the developments of Hong Kong's financial markets. In 1989, the Securities and Futures Commission was created to ensure that the systemic failures of 1987 would never happen again. However, in 1998, Hong Kong financial markets experienced another bout of volatility. So much so that after much reflection, the Securities and Futures Ordinance was introduced in 2003. But that is another story.